In 2023, a character returned to Doctor Who 57 years after his first and only other screen appearance.
The Toymaker.
The end credits of the 14th Doctor's final story, The Giggle, quite rightly credit the creation of the villain to a writer called Brian Hayles, whose main claim to fame was inventing the Ice Warriors. But the true authorship behind the original 4-episode encounter is a puzzle that's been debated for decades. Now that 1966 story, The Celestial Toymaker, has been released with CGI animation to accompany the original audio soundtrack, bringing this quirky story to a whole new audience. But if you find yourself a little baffled by some of the plot points and strange character beats, allow me to offer some explanation by summarising the key facts of the turmoil that engulfed the writing of The Celestial Toymaker in 1966. Facts which have been repeated many times in books and magazines over the decades, even to this day. Original writer Brian Hayles backed out of the scripting process very early because the concept was so dark that it practically drove him insane.
Liar!
Because Hayles backed out, the entire first draft was written by his story editor Donald Tosh, who transformed the script into a drawing room comedy, to which Tosh added a creepy aunt and uncle duo. The aunt and uncle were a pair of loathsome characters lifted from an irrelevant and obscure pre-war play called George and Margaret.
Liar!
The script, which was originally just called The Toymaker, had a Chinese trilogic game added during rewrites by Donald Tosh, and consequently the Toymaker character was given an oriental makeover. Replacement story editor Jerry Davis was instructed to write out George and Margaret and replace them with 6 new characters, and this was an enforced change by BBC management, which left the production in turmoil, and consequently none of the dialogue from either of the original versions survives.
Liar!
It seems as if someone has made a jigsaw puzzle out of the history of this scripting process. So we have 3 writers, Brian Hayles, Donald Tosh and Jerry Davis, each of whom have taken credit for different versions of the Celestial Toymaker, with 2 entire versions of the script apparently lost. But thanks to recently rediscovered original paperwork, we can now separate fantasy from reality and shed light on the unprecedented number of fallacies which have built up around this mostly missing serial. Follow us into the labyrinth of lies as we try to reveal the real authors behind these bizarre scripts, the true motivation behind the hefty rewrites, and finally come to understand the Toymaker's human playthings who have been airbrushed from history, the mysterious George and Margaret. According to the credits of The Celestial Toymaker, broadcast in 1966, it was written solely by Brian Hayles. But the overseeing script editor of the time, Donald Tosh, said,
Brian told me he didn't think he was up to writing a full script, but he allowed me to use the idea, and so I wrote the first draft.
Tosh asserts that in his writing stage, he decided the Toymaker should appear as a Chinese Mandarin, and it was also at this point he, somewhat bizarrely, chose to shape the story towards what was later described as
a sort of pseudo-smart Noel Coward comedy.
Into this version, he says he added 2 new characters called George and Margaret, who were apparently lifted from the work of a playwright called Gerald Savory. And we will come back to him. But then came Jerry Davis, the script editor who inherited the project from Tosh, and he says he was dealt a bad hand by being forced to entirely rewrite the scripts. In his words,
I, in fact, wrote the story that appeared on the screen, having put it together at the very last minute.
According to Davis, the instruction for the rewrite came from above and caused chaos behind the scenes. Tosh's account follows suit, and he says,
Jerry Davis had completely rewritten it. I was horrified. He turned it into a sort of pantomime, which was not at all what I had in mind.
So, according to accepted history, interference by BBC management was the driving force for throwing out a self-indulgent period comedy by Donald Tosh, which was only loosely based on an idea by Brian Hayles. The resulting screen version was a highly inconsistent and jumbled pantomime. The problem with this summary is it's almost entirely untrue. This video is an extremely detailed deep dive which has been in development for 2 years and which I think makes some new headway in Doctor Who script archaeology. I am eternally grateful to Rhys Williams for his help gathering sources, working on this script and thrashing out theories. I am also very thankful to David Brunt for his exhaustive work in the archives and for offering key facts from his utterly invaluable book, The Doctor Who Production Diary, The Hartnell Years, which I highly recommend. There is a link in the description. If you enjoy this video and want to support our forensic work into Doctor Who history, mostly focusing on the Daleks with the occasional side quest like this, we'd gratefully receive your support on Patreon to help us pay the bills. Working with the original production paperwork and with meticulous attention to the final scripts, let's look at what really happened and shatter some very big and long-standing myths. Around the start of July 1965, writer Brian Hayles pitched an idea for Doctor Who that he would later describe as
very close to a psychological horror play.
The earliest surviving paperwork from the summer of 1965 shatters the first long-held myth. It encapsulates the original pitch for this story by saying that Doctor Who meets a space Mandarin and falls beneath his power. This immediately puts to bed any debate over the original Far Eastern styling of the character. It was unquestionably the intention from the outset to depict an otherworldly villain with an Oriental appearance, so this did not come in later during rewrites as Tosh misremembered. Furthermore, we can address Tosh's belief about the title of the serial changing. We can see from paperwork as early as the 30th of July 1965 that the head of copyright refers to the Celestial Toymaker from the very beginning, so this was not added later by Tosh either. Celestial was a reference to one of China's names being the Celestial Empire, as well as being a play on this Mandarin being from space. The term would crop up again a decade later with the programme's other Chinese villain.
You mean to say the Celestial Chang was involved in all these Machiavellian machinations?
And in 2023, the Doctor rather pointedly resurrects the term
Celestial.
So at a time in the 1960s, when Marvel's Iron Man was battling his Mandarin, and Flash Gordon was also up against the kind of space Mandarin, it was the turn of Doctor Who to conjure his own version of this stereotype. The challenge that Brian Hayles' Mandarin would present to the Doctor would be to solve 4 complex riddles. The unsavoury trope of Oriental puzzles set by an evil magician would be revisited in The Talons of Weng Chiang a decade later.
He's left us a Chinese puzzle.
The story idea of an unsettling and intellectual foe instead of a typical monster appealed to both story editor Donald Tosh and producer John Wiles, who wanted to broaden the programme and make it darker. Hayles was duly commissioned on the 29th of July 1965 to script The Celestial Toymaker. And here we discover the next piece of the paper trail which shatters another long-held belief. Contrary to any subsequent retellings of the events, Brian Hayles did indeed deliver full scripts, his first drafts all being completed in September 1965, in which the Space Mandarin character battles Doctor Who, and of course companions Stephen and Anne. Wait, what? That's right, Anne. Because another tantalising fact that has often been overlooked in all this is that the production team were very rapidly coming up with and then ditching new companions at this point. In early summer 1965, the production team had soured on actress Maureen O'Brien, who played Vicky, and consequently the character was unceremoniously dropped at the end of The Mythmakers. A temporary replacement called Katerina was created, who was briefly written into the Daleks' master plan before being quickly killed off. Terry Nation dutifully dispatched her in episode 4 of the Daleks' master plan, which was delivered in mid-August 1965. John Wiles and Donald Tosh then settled upon the new companion of Anne Shapley, a character who would debut in John Lucarotti's The Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Eve, and word was sent out in mid to late August to add this rather naive 16th century servant girl into the scripts that were being developed. One example of a writer facing this task was Paul Erickson, who had originally written his story of The Ark featuring Vicky, but following the rapid turnover of young women, if you'll pardon the expression, he was required to incorporate Anne Shapley instead. Paul Erickson delivered his revised scripts for The Ark featuring Anne Shapley on the 7th of September, and only a week later, Brian Hayles handed in episode 1 of The Celestial Toymaker. Hales' September scripts all had a TARDIS team of the Doctor, Stephen, and Anne Shapley facing the Toymaker and his playthings. That being the case, then suddenly one or two oddities in the final screen version of the Celestial Toymaker make a lot more sense, as we will see. So what was the next step in its development? Tosh has sometimes claimed to have written, or at least finished, the first draft, which was said to be very dark in tone. We've now seen this was not the case, it was all Hales. But what about the next iteration of the script? A rewrite had to be done to steer it in a lighter direction, and most commentators and historians agree that this was probably where Tosh really stepped in. So it was something of a shock to see what the paperwork actually stated. As it turns out, there was one person whose accounts of these events should not have been overlooked. The original author himself, Brian Hayles, gave only one substantial interview about Doctor Who in September 1978, a month before he sadly died. In this interview, he said something remarkable, which has been largely ignored for over 40 years.
There were two versions. The first one was very close to a psychological horror play, and although the producer John Wiles liked it enormously, he found that for children it was just too powerful, so I had to rewrite it.
Surprisingly, this comment has never been given much credence in the countless histories concerning the writing of the Celestial Toymaker, presumably due to those who outlived him having the opportunity to repeat their recollection of events, irrespective of whether it bore any resemblance to the truth. And so it was with great delight that the paperwork revealed to us through David Brunt's new book absolutely confirms that Hales was right. Far from folding and running for the hills, leaving Tosh to do all the work, not only did Hales write full first drafts, but 2 months later, in November 1965, Hales delivered a full set of second drafts of the Celestial Toymaker. So, contrary to some accounts, we've now established that Hales actually worked very hard on this story. He created a Mandarin Toymaker character who set riddles, and for a while his version included the naive young Anne Shapley. But what else can we uncover about the Hales version of this script, and how much of what ended up on screen was actually his? Here is where things get interesting. Aside from the production paperwork, which gives us a few critical dates, we are fortunate enough to have a complete set of camera scripts. These invaluable documents are full of vital clues to be gleaned. Due to the laborious typesetting and printing process for scripts, alterations were done as efficiently as possible. Wherever changes had to be made, if possible, the old page was kept, with alterations being done by blanking out and sometimes overwriting the original text. Only if extreme changes were needed, then it was unavoidable for an entire fresh page to be typed up. The final version of this script is therefore a patchwork of pages, either ones bearing all of the scars of their changes, which show they are older drafts, or being pristine, which means they're newly typed. We also know without question that pages with certain characters are written later, for example the two clowns, so that helps us work things out on a process of elimination too. So by analysing sample pages whose authorship is definitely known, then with a lot of careful scrutiny of the typography, the formatting and the phrasing, we were able to isolate some clues as to which pages could be attributed to each version of the script, and therefore which author. The most useful tell turned out to be that all the pages that we're certain were written by Brian Hayles have a highly unusual 3 spaces after full stops and character names, instead of the usual 1 or 2. Compare this to pages of script we know for certain were written by Jerry Davis, for reasons we'll come on to, and he, like most other writers, only uses double spacing. Davis also seems to have a tell of his own. He repeatedly fails to capitalise the D of Doctor, so that's a useful identifier for his work. Not every trait appears consistently, and we must use all the clues together to unravel this. So, armed with this insight, we can confirm which pages of the final patchwork script, which is the only one that survives, were completely untouched Brian Hayles material, and we can start to build a detailed picture of Hales's original contribution. The first thing that comes to light is that the opening moments in the TARDIS were written by Hayles, with the Doctor becoming invisible and fearful of a great power that can penetrate the TARDIS safety barrier. Hayles also wrote the Toymaker's memory window, which is used to torment the companions. And let's not forget that in Hales's original script, the female companion in question was Anne Shapley, so it would have been her mourning her parent in the Toymaker's memory window. Furthermore, I would suggest that it would make the most sense if it was Anne seeing the death of her father rather than her mother, as this was an event already established in the programme. We know from her introductory story that her father was murdered by the Catholics at Vassay, and in the book it's said that he was basically burned alive. So this would have huge resonance not just for Anne, but also the viewer, as his death was a key plot point which drew Anne into the narrative in her debut adventure, and the event no doubt traumatised her. When her father was killed, it left her an orphan, and she was taken in by her aunt. This is almost exactly the scenario which is given for replacement companion Dodo, who merrily declares she has no parents and lives with her great aunt, and it's therefore fine for her to run away in the TARDIS. In this context, it seems extremely obvious that when Anne was swapped for Dodo, her backstory was just transferred over. I find it very curious that the bizarre four-letter nickname Dodo was invented, as it would make life a lot easier if this page had actually been written for Anne, as the name could just be overwritten with Dodo and greatly streamline the redrafting process. We presume that Dodo was written into the second version of the Hayles scripts, but we can't be certain because there's no paperwork which dates the creation of Dodo. Hayles delivered episodes 1 and 2 of his redraft prior to the earliest known mention of Dodo, which is on the 19th of November, in which TV Comic is asked not to refer to the extinct bird as the dodo to avoid a clash, which leads to a very weird comic about the dodo in which they're not allowed to be called the dodo. It's impossible to say how much of Hales's horror-heavy first draft survived into this lighter second draft, but being forced to watch past traumas might well be a surviving element of the very first version, which was overall deemed too dark for the target audience. On this page we find that Hayles originated the idea of the multiple TARDISes scrolling by, as if on a conveyor belt, although in his version they were revealed behind a wall that pulsates and clears. Hayles gives us some of the backstory between the Doctor and the Toymaker, and he outlines the evil nature of the villain who condemns participants to live as his toys. But what about the most noteworthy game in the Toymaker's realm, the trilogic game? Donald Tosh says that the trilogic game was his idea, and his account is the accepted history, or at least the most frequently heard. Jerry Davis has a different view, saying that the trilogic game was all Hayles. So who is proven right from the evidence in the script? On this page, from what is surely the Hayles draft, we see the Toymaker presents his challenge to the Doctor. He must play the trilogic game, and over the following 3 pages, Hayles has the characters explain the rules. This puts to bed the idea that this challenge was added in a later draft. If this game did originate from Tosh, as he claims, it could only have been as a suggestion at the storyline stage prior to writing, but we can see it was definitely in the script that Hayles delivered. Tosh made the claim in various interviews that he believed it to be a puzzle originating from China and thought it fitted nicely with the Mandarin-themed antagonist. In reality, this puzzle game, known as the Tower of Hanoi, was popularised by a French mathematician in the 19th century, but there are numerous myths about its origins in the East. One myth concerns the labours of monks in a temple in Hanoi in Vietnam, hence the name. This is how the concept of the game was explained in the Doctor Who production file, and it was of enough interest that the Radio Times ran a little feature on it explaining the rules. Moving back to the action, and we have a big juicy artifact to examine at the end of episode 1. A surviving page which reveals an early version of the cliffhanger concludes much the same as the final broadcast version, but with one significant difference. Stephen and Dodo open an ordinary cupboard to be disappointed that they have not secured their freedom, and they find a riddle such as was promised in Hales' original pitch. Contrast this to the final version of the script, where the cupboard has been changed to a fake TARDIS. We pick up Hales' work again, with the Doctor and Toymaker playing the trilogic game, and the Toymaker says that Dodo has sat on the wrong chair. The chair game is often assumed to be one of Donald Tosh's editions, yet here we are with the familiar deadly seating decisions being pondered over in an earlier draft. Skipping ahead to episode 3, in terms of completely untouched Hales pages, there are very few, but this in itself is interesting because we know from a letter written to Hales in January about his script that the dancing floor, which appears in later drafts, was already in the Hales version. That means that the game with the obstructive ballerinas is his original material, despite going through the rewrite. It also therefore means that there could be even more of Hales' ideas or dialogue which survive, but we'll never know because they are retyped or reformatted in the Tosh rewrite. Towards the end of the episode, we find Stephen and Dodo trapped inside a cupboard and looking for a way out. Finding the next riddle triggers the door to open, and they proceed down a passage. We know from the aforementioned letter that Hales' script included some kind of maze. As it happens, a confusing labyrinth of corridors would be a feature of the Toymaker's return in The Giggle, and similar to how the Warren of Corridors led to obstacles for the 14th Doctor and Donna, it seems that in Brian Hayles' script, the maze was an integral setup to 2 challenges faced by our heroes. That same letter to Hales says that the first games in the maze demanded what Tosh called splendid special effects, but of these we can only speculate as they are excised from the script. But before we go too far, it's important to note we have glossed over something very important. What about supporting characters in this story? Aside from the Toymaker himself, who else did our heroes meet in their quest in the original version? There's one particular duo who come up time and again in the telling of this story's development.
Brian Hayles' original scripts had included a grotesque aunt and uncle who were key protagonists. Totally stupidly, I was going to name them after an aunt and uncle of mine, Charlie and Marjorie.
We don't know whether Brian Hayles had originally written his aunt and uncle with no names, or come up with his own names, or whether this discussion about what to call them happened before he put pen to paper on his first draft. But what we do know is that they did not end up as Charlie and Marjorie. As Jerry Davis says,
Hales had been asked to write this thing about these 2 characters. Donald Tosh thought it would be terribly funny to do a Doctor Who version of George and Margaret.
George and Margaret never made it to the screen version of the Celestial Toymaker, but remarkably, their presence can be found in the script, and I don't just mean inferred, they are there on the page in black and white. This is the opening of episode 2, showing the reprise of the previous week's cliffhanger, and we find it is an unmodified remnant of an earlier draft, complete with stage directions for the mysterious George and Margaret. So we'll analyse these characters' involvement shortly, but first we need to ask, what on earth does Jerry Davis mean by a Doctor Who version of George and Margaret? Why does he say those names as though they should mean something to us? Well, because to him, like many people living in the post-war era, it was a reference that people understood. And here's why. George and Margaret was the title of a stage play written in 1937 by a then out-of-work actor called Gerald Savory. It debuted at the Wyndham Theatre, later home to Curse of the Daleks, on the 25th of February 1937. The play centred around an ordinary middle-class family called the Garth Banders. It was a domestic comedy revolving around mealtimes, in which the family of 5, plus a boyfriend and maid, discuss the tribulations of their suburban life. But 2 characters who never appear in the play are the titular couple, George and Margaret. Mother Alice has invited George and Margaret to dinner, much to the upset of the rest of the family, who generally don't like the impending visitors at all. After 3 acts of bickering about romance, bad puns and trivial misunderstandings, the punchline to the entire show is that just as George and Margaret finally arrive, the curtain falls and the audience never meets these much maligned characters. It is not an exceptional script, but in the hands of a skillful cast, the play is lively and amusing, and also full of the intrigue of pre-war attitudes towards sex and marriage. It was very successful in the West End, and it went to Broadway, where it was directed by Noel Coward. It was popular amongst theatre companies around the country, as seen in these photos kindly granted to us by Hebden Bridge Little Theatre, who put on their own performance in 1940. But what was a supposedly obscure pre-war play being integrated into an episode of Doctor Who nearly 30 years later? The first thing is to dispel the idea that it was a forgotten play. In the year it opened, 20 minutes of extracts of a performance from the Wyndham Theatre were broadcast on the radio, immediately bringing it to a wider audience. This was the first of several performances which were heard on the wireless, with the next in 1948 and another in 1950, each of which was repeated. Meanwhile, a film version had been made at Teddington Studios in 1940, which introduces scenes set in a kitchen which are not in the stage play, and significantly creates the new character of the cook. In 1946, a stage production was broadcast live on BBC television, followed 2 years later by the first studio-based TV version. In the mid-50s, the play's creator, Gerald Savory, became a writer, producer and production manager for Granada Television. One of the series he had worked on, the ITV Play of the Week, mounted their own production of George and Margaret, which was seen on television on the 12th of March 1956. Around this time, the Radio Times affirmed that George and Margaret was one of the most popular domestic comedies ever to be put on the stage. Quite the statement. Jump forward to April 1966, the very month that The Celestial Toymaker would be broadcast, Fanny Craddock said this about the conclusion of a play that she had written.
The next day, and they're bringing this French couple to dinner that night. So, of course, the George and Margaret Inn.
The fact that she could say, the George and Margaret End, and expect it to be understood shows that this was relevant terminology, at least to a certain demographic. But there's one final puzzle piece needed to explain these characters' inclusion in The Celestial Toymaker. In late 1965, a new head of serials took over at the BBC, effectively the overall boss of Doctor Who. This was none other than the author of George and Margaret, Gerald Savory. The Celestial Toymaker was being developed just as Savory joined, when Hales, or Tosh, or both, were pondering what to call the hideous aunt and uncle characters. Tosh says he went to his new boss and made a request.
I have these 2 characters who are very sinister and strange. Really something out of a very, very awful children's nightmare, and I want to call them George and Margaret as a sort of gentle salute to you and to welcome you, as it were. I said, nobody's going to really get the joke, may I do it? And he said, thank you, that is very kind. Yes, go away and do it.
So here we arrive at the truth of the whole business. Contrary to many accounts, the Celestial Toymaker did not borrow the characters of George and Margaret from some obscure pre-war play. In reality, Brian Hayles had created his own creepy aunt and uncle characters as part of his psychological drama, and as an amusing in-joke to their boss, they asked permission to use the names from his well-known play. If he was to refuse, they were just going to call them something else. We might suppose that they were initially more generic characters in the Hales version, and perhaps Tosh tinkered in his rewrite and emphasised the connection to Savory's version of George and Margaret. That being the case, what do we actually know about the eponymous pair from the play, elements which might have been brought across into the Celestial Toymaker? We learn that they lived in the Far East for a good many years, that George suffered illness, and tells a story about how his punker once broke. This was an overhead swinging fan in colonial homes. We know that George gave the father of the family, Malcolm, cigars for Christmas, but they remain unsmoked 2 months later. We know less of Margaret, just that she is very patriotic and probably appreciates seeing red, white and blue around the place. When they visit, they and the family all play bridge together. The last time they visited, George ended up being trapped in the toilet because the lock was faulty. Their main flaw, according to Alice, is that they never stay long, if they turn up at all. Most of the family insist that George and Margaret are ghastly, but the mother, Alice, says they are nice people who were good to her in the past. The intelligent and decent son, Claude, asserts that George and Margaret are steady and respectable people. So in fact, the supposedly dreaded nature of George and Margaret has been somewhat overstated over the years, and furthermore the Garth Banders family are not a likeable bunch themselves. They are mostly immature, ungrateful and fairly irritating people who inadvertently lock guests in their toilets, so their opinions need to be taken with a pinch of salt. Thus, with a little more context, we should probably think of George and Margaret in a more positive light. Indeed, a colourful and gregarious picture of the pair would chime more with what Tosh said about his version of the script, in which George and Margaret are, initially at least, frightfully jolly characters, although becoming increasingly menacing due to the influence of the Toymaker. Tosh would later describe them in his version as
kind of vampiric, nightmarish characters.
So we now have a better picture of those missing characters and of the lost Toymaker scripts. But what we find is that aside from George and Margaret being deleted, large chunks aren't quite so lost after all, as the final version contains a surprisingly large amount of early material. We can say with confidence that a week before Christmas 1965, 4 fully redrafted scripts by Brian Hayles sat on the desk of Donald Tosh that, from the outset, featured a space mandarin setting a series of puzzles, dolls, riddles, dancing, chairs, mind games, the trilogic game, plus an enthusiastic 1930s-era couple called George and Margaret, who befriend and then slowly turn on the Doctor's companions. Donald Tosh has therefore taken quite a lot of credit for material he doesn't seem to have written. That's not to say he didn't work on the scripts though. The Hales drafts did need his attention for a number of reasons, so let's see what that work entailed. Although he and his producer John Wiles loved the scripts and felt they were exactly the direction that Doctor Who should be taken, there was some work to be done. For one thing, Anne Shapley needed turning into new companion Dodo, although, as we've seen, not much effort was necessarily put into this transformation. This might account for a level of naivety in Dodo's behaviour which would be less incongruous coming from a 16th century French child. The other main problem that Tosh needed to address was the maze and its dazzling set-piece games. We know from the letter dated the 17th of January that due to either cost or practicalities, the maze games had to be deleted from the script. Consequently, Tosh felt that with these games gone, the maze setup didn't work, so this too was removed, leaving a large hole in the script. This hole was filled by a tedious game of Hunt the Key, although who exactly participated in this game is something we'll come to shortly. The removal of the maze and its associated games are in fact the only changes recorded in the production paperwork that we can be 100% certain were implemented by Tosh, but it's safe to infer that he did more than the bare minimum, especially if it's true that he was the one more invested in turning the generic aunt and uncle into George and Margaret. From this point, it becomes very hard to separate Hales's original material from Tosh's rewrite done around January 1966. What we can do is continue to look for clues in the final version of the script which might help us understand what was present in the most developed version of the lost scripts, i.e. what was the intermediate incarnation like after Hales delivered but before Gerry Davis enters the frame and creates the broadcast version. We know from our glimpse of this surviving snippet that George and Margaret were of course present in the original episode 1. This ties up with what we're later told about them being replaced by a pair of clowns. It would be fair to hypothesize that George and Margaret also played some form of blind man's buff, which is a variant of tag played blindfolded. This was, after all, a popular parlour game in the olden days and would have fitted with the 1930s aunt and uncle characters. It also seems likely given that in the final screen version, the game played is not Blind Man's Buff, but instead an assault course with a blindfold on. This is suggestive that the name of the game might be carried over from the earlier draft, despite the action changing following the introduction of the clowns. As mentioned, we're lucky enough to see the January 66 version of the Episode 1 cliffhanger accidentally preserved, and this reveals George and Margaret playing cooperatively along with Stephen and Dodo, discovering an empty cupboard. When the drama resumes in Episode 2, we can see yet more of the January 66 script survives, evidenced by a blanked out area of stage direction revealing the exact number of spaces where the words George and Margaret would have been. And the spacing tells us that the first line of this scene originally belonged to Margaret too, showing the four of them working things out as a team. We see more evidence of the January 66 version surviving when the conversation in the broadcast version mentions the two clowns, but it didn't originally. If we take the number of letters for those three words, plus the conspicuous gap after it, then we have exactly the right number of letters for it to have originally said George and Margaret. What we therefore originally learnt in this scene is that George and Margaret were real people who came to the Toymaker's realm, they lost the game, and became his toys for all eternity. They are stored away in suspended animation in the giant doll's house, which is an impressive part of the set. The focus of the structure was on the child's bedroom, harking back to Hales's original sinister themes of childhood memories. But as well as being a doll's house, stylistically, it's certainly a suitable place for period characters from a domestic comedy to live. And it's telling that the first game takes place in front of a grand wardrobe with alcoves and cupboards decorated with figures in vintage costumes. So then, let's consider, if George and Margaret were conceived as aunt and uncle characters, what defines them in that familial way, rather than simply a husband and wife? To whom are they avuncular and maternal, which is a word I didn't know before? This brings us to the character of Cyril, who in the broadcast version appears in 3 different guises in episodes 2, 3 and 4. But despite his changes of appearance, he is intended to be the same person throughout. Not only does he retain his name, but he is seen discarding his chef's hat as he takes on the role of the schoolboy. Stephen and Dodo and Cyril all recognise each other when they meet up again. In terms of his overall creation, nobody takes any credit for it. Jerry Davis says,
"I wrote a jolly mischievous schoolboy."
This is in response to the accusation that he was lifted from Billy Bunter, and he's suggesting that the similarity to this copyrighted character is a coincidence. But since the script states in black and white that he is a Billy Bunter of a boy, I would hesitate to take this quote at face value. To perhaps get to the bottom of who might have originally created him, there are some interesting observations to make. Cyril is an ancient name, but it was repopularized due to one of the main characters of E.M. Forster's 1924 novel A Passage to India, and as shown by Google Books Ngram Viewer, the name Cyril became popular around the same time as Claude, which was the name of one of the Garth Bander's family in Savory's play George and Margaret. Is it possible that within this house and its various settings, Cyril was devised as part of the 1930s drawing room comedy setup? Was he a mercurial kind of nephew to George and Margaret, perhaps creating the opportunity for some of that pseudo-smart Noel Coward dialogue we're told about? And later, when Stephen and Dodo visit the kitchen of the doll's house and its cook, possibly inspired by the film version of George and Margaret, do they find a different version of nephew Cyril, now a kitchen boy? So, as we've mentioned the cook, are there any other clues about different people encountered in an earlier version? Because we're often told that Sergeant Rugg the cook and others were created to replace George and Margaret, and therefore should not be in the earlier draft. Let's look at the opening of episode 3. These 2 consecutive pages have huge chunks of deleted material. This tells us that the pages are from January 66 or earlier. What we can see in this passage is that the Toymaker refers to the Doctor's friends beating both of the Toymaker's teams. The first team was presumably George and Margaret, who we might suppose, after losing a good-humoured game of Blind Man's Buff, then decide to join Stephen and Dodo in their quest. in which case, who would be the second team? This is another page left over from an old draft, with a huge chunk of description deleted. From the ghosts of the original lettering left on the page, we can tease out where it seems to be describing the new characters who will arrive in episode 3, one of whom has a large moustache. So who was this character with the notable face furniture, and why was his introduction deleted? Either this was a completely different new character of which we know nothing, or, more likely, it was Sergeant Rugg, who goes on to appear in the final screen version. If it is indeed Rugg, then the oft-told version of events in which George and Margaret were replaced with entirely new characters such as Sergeant Rugg and Mrs. Wiggs is also not correct. Another tiny scrap of evidence for Sergeant Rugg already existing prior to the broadcast version is that neither he nor Mrs. Wiggs are ever given any introductory description in the final version of the camera script. This is suggestive of their original introduction having been in the earlier January 66 script, presumably on page 4, mixed in with material that had to be removed. Is it possible that the missing material also still featured George and Margaret, and that's why it needed deleting? If so, I wonder if the accounts of George and Margaret being replaced by Wiggs and Rugg are actually a misremembered version of events, and in reality they coexisted, and the Davis rewrite merely merged them together rather than creating whole new characters. The merging of existing characters might explain the ill-defined dynamic whereby Wiggs and Rugg behave sometimes like bickering husband and wife, sometimes more like acquaintances, and they're sometimes hostile to Stephen and Dodo, and sometimes more friendly, although it could also just be bad writing. A detail which might connect to this is how the multiple roles played by the same actors are handled differently depending on the actor. As mentioned, Cyril, who is played by Peter Stevens, has several guises which are all accepted essentially as costume changes, and his personality maintains continuity. This feels more natural and unsettling as part of the Toymaker's mind games, and I suspect this could be a feature of the original Hales story. But this approach is not taken with the pair of characters played by Campbell Singer and Carmen Silvera. These actors, who were originally cast as George and Margaret, in the broadcast serial take on the roles of the two clowns, Joey and Clara, in episode 1, King Henry and the Queen in episode 2, and Rugg and Wiggs in episode 3. So unlike with Cyril, not only is each persona given a different name, but at no point are the facial similarities remarked upon, despite them having more prominent interactions throughout with Stephen and Dodo. In fact, they go to lengths to hide them being the same actors, giving them heavy makeup as the clowns, a high-pitched voice for Silvera, and no dialogue at all for Singer. Received wisdom is that Jerry Davis entirely invented the Hart family, including King Henry and the Queen, in his final rewrite. So in the January 66 version, did Stephen and Dodo have no other opponents? Was Cyril present, and if so, in what form? This question of Cyril's presence opens a huge can of worms, because of course in the screen version, Cyril also forms part of the Hart family. He is set apart from them though, because he retains his own character name. This section of script from the January 66 draft has a section of Stephen's dialogue blanked out in which he's apparently summarising either the characters they've met or the games they've played. But if that's the case, here's the curveball. Dodo recognises Cyril as the Jack of Hearts. Does this hint at some or all of the playing cards actually being from an earlier draft, similar to our suspicions about Rugg and Wiggs? It's really tough to unpick any further details about these supporting characters, because the rewrites are so extensive. But there are tantalising possibilities here, so on many of these points, I'm just going to leave you with these questions to ponder. Let us know your thoughts on Cyril and the Hart family in the comments. On a related note about connections and inspirations, I'm always struck by the Queen's line, "We shall remain playing cards for the rest of eternity." As stated, one of the few things we know about George and Margaret is that they love playing cards. So if they were to find themselves trapped in an endless bridge tournament at a dinner table, then they would indeed be playing cards for all eternity. in a different sense. It's probably a reach, but maybe this line was originally spoken by Margaret, which took on a new meaning when given to different characters. Or it could be a total coincidence. At this point, the Hales and Tosh version of the script was completed, and Tosh clearly felt he made quite a significant contribution to the dialogue, as evidenced by the co-writing credit, which would have originally appeared here to explain the strange alignment, where his name was later removed. Tosh then went on holiday to France, but he was never really coming back, as he'd already tendered his resignation and he was working his notice period. He wrote a letter before he left, that one of the 17th of January, telling Brian Hayles that the author would soon receive the final 2 rewritten scripts, and he hoped that Hayles wouldn't be too disgusted with his changes. But the Tosh rewrites underran. Episode 2 was short by a sizable 4 minutes, and the others between 2 and 3 minutes too short. So the week after Tosh had gone on holiday, producer John Wiles took elements from Brian Hayles' original version and found ways to reintroduce sections to bring it up to the correct length. This is why there are more Hayles pages surviving than Tosh might have otherwise wanted, but it's good for us as it's allowed us to see what was present in the draft that had otherwise been discarded. Producer John Wiles, having completed his patchwork script duties, was also departing Doctor Who. Like his script editor, he too had tendered his resignation and he was working his notice. Following some overlap, the final handover to his replacement Innes Lloyd seems to have been completed by mid-February. So with 3 weeks to go until the cameras rolled, there was a script ready to shoot, with which Brian Hayles and Donald Tosh were very happy, as was the producer John Wiles. Casting was done, sets were built, and everything was going well. And then someone played a wild card. We know that by the time Tosh went on holiday, his replacement, Gerry Davis, was already flexing his muscles over new scripts. For example, in mid-January, an adventure about Alexander the Great that Tosh had been nurturing was looked at by newcomer Davis, discussed with the other newcomer, producer Innes Lloyd, and rejected, with the note to the author,
"I don't feel this storyline is in the direction my producer and I wish to take with future Doctor Who serials."
And it was apparently during Tosh's holiday that a bombshell was dropped. According to new story editor Gerry Davis, the big boss, Gerald Savory, apparently saw the Toymaker scripts and the manifestation of his previously unseen creations, George and Margaret, and he said no. According to Davis, Gerald Savory hated what Tosh had done with George and Margaret, and with Tosh away and unavailable to consult, Davis was seemingly left with no option but to undertake a wholesale rewrite of the Tosh version. Davis says that he was forced to write at the insane speed of 1 script per day, and so tight on time that pages were being rushed from his typewriter directly to the actors, giving them no time to learn their lines and forcing them to read from prompts. We know this is untrue, as a letter dated the 25th of February discusses the Davis rewrite having already been done, and this was a week before even the earliest pre-filming was due to begin. The story goes that when Donald Tosh returned from holiday, he was flabbergasted to hear about the rewrites being done supposedly at the insistence of Gerald Savory. Tosh was left confused because he'd already gained Savory's permission. Since George and Margaret were not actually in the play that bore their name, they would be unidentifiable by their characterization in the Celestial Toymaker, so surely the simplest option would have been to just change the names, and no one would be any the wiser. The alternative, Charlie and Marjorie, for example. So, was Gerry Davis bluffing about what he said? In later years, a little more context emerged for this sudden rewrite. Although still claiming the problem originated from Gerald Savory, Gerry Davis was less than complimentary about his predecessor Tosh's version of the Toymaker.
It was a bit precious for a young audience, and it was actually pretty tedious.
In another interview around the same time, he said that the George and Margaret characters slowed it down, and he would later say that he disliked the style of the dialogue too. It seems that Davis finally showed his hand about whether Savory was the only force driving the rewrite. Tosh actually had his suspicions about whether Savory was really behind it.
Jerry hated it. He had persuaded Gerald the whole thing was totally unsuitable for Doctor Who, and that the style of the dialogue was absolutely anathema to him, and so it all had to be changed.
Davis would state, however, that Savory thought the Tosh script was rubbish, and so claiming that he not only had the blessing, but the instruction from the boss to dismantle Tosh's drawing room comedy, Davis embarked upon his rewrite.
I literally had to sit down in the garden of the bungalow I'd just bought in Cookham and dash out an act a day.
He must have been soaked and bloody freezing, since this alleged alfresco rewrite was performed in the third week of what was one of the wettest Februaries on record. Anyway, Davis left the framework intact, with the trilogic game remaining and the Toymakers sparring with the Doctor, but with Hartnell needing to be written out for 2 episodes, this battle of wits with the Toymaker was much reduced in the final version. Tosh would later complain,
He then totally rewrote mine. I came back to be presented with a script that had none of my dialogue in it.
There might actually be some truth in this, since it does appear that a lot of what remains from the earlier drafts was actually from Hayles. If it's correct that Tosh was more fixated on George and Margaret, then the obliteration of those characters' traits would essentially remove any Tosh changes and leave a version mostly written by Hayles and rewritten by Davis. One aspect which we can state with certainty was a Davis change was the increased use of the fake TARDIS frontage as a deception, to increase the drama at the end of the first episode. But it's interesting that in the singular example of a page we can compare pre- and post-Davis rewrite, aside from adding the fake TARDIS, the entire page of dialogue is unchanged from the January 1966 version. Davis opts to leave in the exclamations from Dodo and Stephen upon seeing the cupboard is bare, which do not feel like logical comments made at the discovery of an entirely missing space-time machine. It nearly fits, but not quite. This leads to the kind of cognitive dissonance that peppers the final screen version. As for Davis's work on the characters, as we've established, George and Margaret had to go, and it's clear what he's done instead in episode 1. Davis would later say,
I thought Toymaker suggested toys and children. The real suspense in a story comes from innocuous and familiar, turning into something horrific. So I thought that the whole world could be toys, which are like people, such as the clowns.
The Toymaker's domain seems to contain both toys who come alive and real people who lose the Toymaker's games getting turned into toys. Both of these options were picked up again in the 2023 episode The Giggle, which sees the character of Charlie Banerjee consigned to the fate of becoming a puppet forever, and also the Stookie family of puppets that go on the attack. One of the only quotes we have about the creation of new characters is this:
I chucked out the characters of George and Margaret and turned them into clowns.
But Davis kills off the clowns at the end of episode 1, whereas the original teammates, George and Margaret, continued the journey. The changes made by Davis become one of the many unsatisfying flaws in the final screen version, as it deprives the guest cast of an arc story as they are constantly rebooted, and it's clear in the original version that the sinister turning of the aunt and uncle was a vital through line on our hero's journey. As for the other guest characters, we've asked plenty of questions about their origins, and we are lacking concrete answers. But it's plain to see that the accepted history of the writing of this bizarre story is more of a brain teaser than any of the riddles set by the Toymaker. Hopefully we've been able to untangle some of these knots and cut through the fog of dubious anecdotes, suggesting where we can some plausible paths for the threads that we've found. We can be in no doubt that Brian Hayles' credit for the creation of this character is well deserved, but we also need to give him far more credit for all the elements that make up the story as a whole. People's views of the Celestial Toymaker tend to be quite positive, but it does seem that the original Hayles and Tosh version might have been a more logical and polished storyline with a better payoff for the characters that were included. But it's a tremendous irony that unfortunately, just like in Savory's original play, George and Margaret are ultimately the characters fated never to appear.